Thanks for joining us. I'd like to start by asking you to expand on a point you made during your presentation, which is about the need to study the local and the global in parallel.
I think the old sort of traditional area studies tradition was really about looking areas as bounded entities. And so we wanted to try and understand what went on in that entity as if it was an area unto itself. What I think there's increasing recognition of is that areas are not bounded static entities, but are open, porous, subject to globalization, very open to transnational flows of all kinds of people, of products, of goods, of ideas. And as a consequence, in order to understand an area, you really need to understand the diversity of its transnational connections. And that is why you get a sort of movement towards a new transnational area studies approach as such.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what you meant the need to look beyond studying the nation or the state or the nation and the state simply in isolation?
I think the traditional area studies tradition was very much focused on the nation and the state as the framework of analysis, because it was very much a sort of Cold War mentality that it was this state versus another state. Whereas I think what we're beginning to recognize much more of is that nations are still important, states are still important because we still function within that, but they are not entities unto themselves only. States and nations interact with other states and nations. At the people-to-people level, there are these flows as well, and therefore the nation needs to be understood alongside the transnation.
So you raised some concerns about university ranking systems that are currently used globally. Can you expand on that point, please?
University rankings have become so popular, and there are probably at least 1 or 2 new rankings that are popping up every year around the world. The dominance of rankings done by agencies coming out of a sort of Western, particularly Anglo-American tradition, that sort of dominance is very strong, which means that the sorts of metrics that are used tend to privilege those sorts of contexts, quite understandably in terms of how those rankings have emerged. So for example, rankings will look at criteria like citation counts. They will look at things like what journals people publish in. But who's saying that these journals are more important than other journals? Who's saying that English language journals should be privileged over vernacular language journals? The way the rankings are done, they privilege these sorts of particular criteria, which means that how we respond to the rankings game is also a way in which we're responding to those criteria. What is considered good scholarship? Who says what is good scholarship? What epistemologies are favored at a particular point in time? What are the gatekeepers, the editors of those journals saying are important? These are all situated and contextualized within a sort of Anglo-American setting. And therefore, as we chase those rankings, we are implicitly giving in to a sort of scholarship that is dominated by Western journals, English language journals particularly, and by epistemological ideas coming out of those socio-political and historical contexts.
So in Australia, there's a saying that says, what did the arts graduate say to the business graduate? And the answer is, will you have fries with that, implicating that arts graduates never get jobs. So, but in your presentation, you discussed how liberal arts is becoming increasingly desired by the university community. Can you explain what you meant by that?
This is this sort of growing interest, and I emphasize that it's still growing. It's not by any means arrived, so to speak. But this nascent growing interest in the liberal arts is a phenomenon of the last perhaps 5 years or so, and because of this project that I'm working on, the Yale NUS College within the context of Singapore, I've had the opportunity to speak to university leaders in different parts of Asia, particularly in China and South Korea, and to some extent in India, to some extent in Japan, definitely in Taiwan as well. I've also had the opportunity to speak to some government leaders in these different places. And this recognition that the world has become so much more globalized, so much more complex. And the people we need to lead us in future generations, whether it is political leaders, business leaders, leaders in arts and culture, in all walks of life, are people who are able to make connections across different domains of knowledge, are able to see connections across different ideas, are able to think critically and creatively, and knowing that this is the sort of graduate that we're trying to educate, these governments and universities have looked at what's happened in America, for example, and concluded that liberal arts education is one form of education that does deliver this sort of quality of a graduate. And so I've seen growing interest, definitely in China, amongst university leaders, amongst government leaders in South Korea, in Taiwan, and in Singapore, to suggest that perhaps there is place in the higher education landscape for liberal arts education. This is not to say that liberal arts education should replace all forms of other education, nor should it be something that everyone has to do before they go on to professional education, as is the case in the US, but definitely recognition that some graduates would definitely benefit from this kind of education in terms of preparing them better for the future.
In your presentation, you use the term in-betweeners to describe both people, but also places. Can you tell us why you use that term specifically?
Sure. I believe in this quite firmly, partly because of personal experience. What do I mean by in-between positionalities of people, of scholars? It's very easy to be schooled and educated in a particular place or in a particular tradition, and to see that as the totality and the universe of knowledge. But knowledge and knowledge production is historically specific, contextually specific, and geographically specific. It's specific to particular socio-historical, socio-political contexts. The sorts of scholars who recognize that best, I think, are the in-between scholars, the ones who have come from different contexts, who've lived and experienced different contexts, and who recognize the specificity of knowledge production, and are able to recognize that that specificity needs to be brought to bear on their study of any particular topic, issue, or area. That in trying to understand China or a particular district in Guangzhou, you need to bring to bear the different positionalities, you need to bring to bear the different perspectives, and you need to recognize that the perspective that a New York scholar studying Guangzhou is very different possibly from the perspective that a Singaporean scholar brings to bear on that study of Guangzhou, and the study of Guangzhou by a Guangzhou native. So that sort of ability to straddle, because you have different experiences and different backgrounds, built up over time. The observations you've made, the lessons you've learned, that are sometimes inchoate, implicit accretions over time. All those things, I think, make for better scholarship, the ability to bring it all together. And that I think is what I mean by the in-betweenness of scholars. By in-betweenness of places, I think that it's about particular places which encourage this kind of openness, which particularly stimulate this kind of recognition of multiple perspectives and multiple flows of information and multiple influences on knowledge production. And these places tend to be the places that are small, open, subject to different influences in and of themselves. And I cite the example of Singapore and Hong Kong, for example. But there was an interesting question from a member of the audience about Australia. And I think Australia, too, in a sense, occupies a certain in-betweenness because of the sense of, are we Western? Are we Asian? And this constant questioning, I think, brings to bear a certain perspective in the study of Asia that would be absent, say, if a Japanese were doing that study or an American was doing that study.